Hello everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I just wanted to give you this quick video to give you some of the timeline and the nuts and bolts about the Haitian Revolution, starting with some of the causes, so that way if you wanted to refer to it. We talked about this slide in class, but just to remind you, one of the places to start with the Haitian Revolution and just understanding the revolt that happens in 1791. It's very much a revolt of enslaved persons. 90% of the island of Haiti is comprised of this pretty diverse group. These would be people who maybe were recently forced to migrate to Haiti. This might have also been a group of people who earlier came to Saint-Domingue, but a great amount of the people of the population in Saint-Domingue, is really serving the mercantile goals of France. And so this becomes largely a story of not only colonialism, but also of slavery. We also see free people of color, so about 30,000 free people of color, also a very diverse group in terms of class. They may have very high economic status, not always, but ultimately politically, not necessarily seen as equal to people who are French, European, considered white. And so there's a great deal of like racial coding that's going on in this particular space. The Grand Blancs and the Petite Blancs ultimately have opposing ideas, especially when it comes into the French Revolution and where they see themselves in either the Third Estate or, the Second Estate and whatnot. But we do see some of this, importance to the groups of people and the way in which they have particular agendas. A lot of the revolution will be connected to these various different agendas. And then also within groups, we see a great deal of challenges where groups of people don't necessarily agree. Some of the timeline that's important to note is the Code Noir, the 1685 code, and sometimes this changes. These are discriminatory rules. They're written by the French government, and largely there are particular emphasis on laws that relate to slavery. There's also laws that relate to free people of color. In some of the cases, there might even have been improvements early on. So in the early 1700s, for example, some reforms for slavery, but enforcing these as far away as Saint-Domingue is generally not the case. So largely the slave holders leave to a number of foremen the task of policing the plantations, and this becomes a place where we see enslavement become fairly violent. So the potential of French laws to really create a great deal of reform isn't necessarily enforced. By 1760, there's also a great deal of uptick in discriminatory laws, and much of this applies to the free people of color who all of a sudden in 1760 are going to be facing laws about what they can wear and what particular ways in which they represent themselves, or political freedoms, that are not going to be equal to the white planters. Okay, so some of these laws that could be examples: people couldn't be doctors, or they couldn't be midwives, they couldn't have certain, we see a degree of, the racism coming into this place. And we looked at some of that in class. So I'm going to kind of move on to the slave revolt in 1789. And this is something, of course, we see the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man isn't going to be long after this. But in 1789, there is a discussion within the French Assembly to give free people of color equal status to free people of color in France. Free people of color in France are given some equal status, and there is a fear at the time that that's going to relate to a slave insurrection. And there is a kind of turmoil, especially in the group of people, free people of color. This is the group that's largely protesting before 1791, and we see some of this in the revolts of a couple of key leaders, and one significant will be Vincent Auger, who is a free person of color. He is in France, kind of hears some of this debate, and then will lead a large-scale revolt in 1790, and this becomes kind of a place where we see white planters, very heavily punish Auger and people who are connected to him to send a message. So there's a great deal of crackdown, in a sense, against some of the ways in which there is a movement of free people of color. In this tension, we start to see the revolt in May 15th, 1791. The May Decree is issued, and it's a very specific law that grants full civil rights to children of two free parents. So it is kind of very specific and limited. There are many people, free people of color, who are not affected by the May Decree, but it sends a symbolic message that the government of France, that is now a revolutionary government, is taking seriously the rights of free people. Ultimately, white elites on the island refuse to enact that. So we start to get tension, and white elites are essentially going to separate themselves into a government that is going to be completely white. And free people of color are going to resent this. The government of France will drop the May Decree. So they're kind of going to solve the issue by completely getting rid of the May Decree. So there's a great uptick in violence. And again, this is related to free people of color seeking more rights from white planters, and especially political power. Free people of color were completely excluded from political power. By 1791, we start to see the full-scale slave rebellion. It is planned in the North. Some historians will make the case that voodoo becomes an expressive religion that enables some degree of cultural connection for groups of people who may be enslaved to connect to maybe some African cultures. Voodoo also is not, legal. It isn't something that is seen as a form of resistance. So to some people, that may be part of the point. And there become specific practitioners, people who are leading some of the ceremonial aspects of voodoo. So it's religious, but it also carries some weight as a unifier. And perhaps we do get some initiators. Bookman Duddy is an initiator, for example. Some historians give him credit with perhaps leading some of this early revolt. By August, right? So this is the end of the month, a couple of weeks in, there's 10,000 individuals who have created an army, and most of this armed effort is focused on destroying plantations, right? So burning plantations to the ground. One incredible challenge will be, after the entirety of the war in Haiti, some of the environmental effects are so significant that Haiti will really be challenged in the decades following the revolution to grow a great deal of agriculture. So the land itself, part of this is from destruction. Some of this is later from the French, the war. So it really has a great deal of this period of revolution has a great deal of effects on modern day Haiti. The Declaration of the Rights of Man comes out, and arguably, and some of you noted this, Enlightenment ideas reach Saint-Domingue. It is in connection with some of the experiences that people have in terms of slavery and in terms of free people of color. So some of the agendas that people had, perhaps even before the Enlightenment ever, really was a thing, we see the Enlightenment language, really kind of connect with some people. And perhaps there's also uniquely within Saint-Domingue a culture of resistance that has some very specific traits, maroonage, resistance, by running away, seeking places to go, voodoo, there is 90% of the population is enslaved. So there is, to some degree, a space for enslaved persons to kind of enable themselves to be able to revolt. We also see in France a great deal of arguments about the necessity of slavery. Some of this is coming up with some Enlightenment thinkers who are questioning slavery at the time. There's a great deal of Christian arguments, that people who are enslaved are actually treated better than the members of the Third Estate. So there's a lot of information in terms of what slavery is for people who are sitting in the French government. Jacobins are very vocal about some of the horrors of slavery, but at the same time, there is a question about what would happen in a society where there is not slavery in Saint-Domingue. Many people in the French, including many Jacobins, are heavily dependent on the economic benefits of slave labor, sugar especially, and there's a competition between England and France and Spain. So if, France doesn't have colonial Haiti, Spain could get colonial Haiti, and Spain is in control of Santo Domingo, the other part of the island. So there's a great deal of, fear that, France kind of needs to hold on to this particular space. And we'll see that even more so when Napoleon comes around. In 1792, the French government will decree all free people of color would be given the full rights of citizenship. So, the May Decree kind of swinging back and forth, a little bit of rights, then take it away. And then all of a sudden in 1792, now we have the French government decrees all free people of color will be given the full rights of citizenship. Okay. The French government and the free people of color are going to be largely working together with this avenue of free people of color, given more space to largely become French. The plan is that there will be greater suppression of a slave revolt, and some free people of color have slaves or have significant economic interests in some of the agricultural spaces that are using slavery. So there is a great deal of kind of connection, so we see this very strange switch where free people of color and white planters seem to be very opposed, but then there's a time where the French government changes their laws and we start to see a very, very different effect and maybe a little bit of almost like a regrouping of people. The French government dispatched 3 commissioners to take control of the colony. And some of these commissioners actually have abolitionist leanings. And some of them are, kind of creating spaces where white planters could be ostracized from political power and free people of color are put into positions of power. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. The last thing that we'll note in this kind of causes thing that gets really complicated is you end up with the Spanish had been very supportive of slave revolts because they want the French out. So, absolutely have the slaves revolt. Toussaint Louverture, who is a free slave, had joined the revolt, is starting to become a leader in the revolt. He becomes an officer in the Spanish army. So he's actually cutting his teeth underneath Spanish rule. And there is also going to be some agreement that there will be freedom for enslaved persons when Spain acquires, the entirety of the island. So in a sense, Toussaint Louverture is not on the French side whatsoever. He's going to be on the Spanish side. The Brits will also invade Saint-Domingue, and they will very, very much get the support of white planters, and they are going to be capitalizing on a great deal of some of the military battles that is already ensuing. So the French, the British, and the Spanish will largely be fighting each other. It's kind of like the Spanish and the British against the French, and the French are trying to defend Saint-Domingue from this particular, kind of foreign intervention. And a lot of this is kind of what's happening in Europe with this first coalition war, and it's playing out in the island of Saint-Domingue. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop there because time for class. Okay.